Lee Radziwill, the woman who refused to be just Jackie's little sister. Caroline Lee Bouvier Radziwill has been called many things: princess, style icon, socialite, muse, failed actress, swan, Jackie Kennedy's little sister. But behind all the labels was a woman who spent her entire life trying to answer a single question: who was Lee, apart from Jackie? In this video, we're exploring the complicated, glittering, often painful life of Lee Radziwill. From the Brooklyn Bridge runaway story to London palaces, the Camelot years, Aristotle Onassis, Truman Capote, the Rolling Stones, Grey Gardens, and the quiet later years, when she finally defined herself on her own terms. You're watching Cultured Elegance. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below, telling me which part of Lee's story surprised you the most. Jacques and Peaks, the second daughter, arrives. Caroline Lee Bouvier was born on March 3, 1933, in New York City, 4 years after her sister, Jacqueline. From the beginning, the two girls were a study in contrast. Jackie, the dark, serious, older sister; Lee, small, pretty, quicker to smile. Like Jackie, Lee grew up between Manhattan and East Hampton, Park Avenue apartments in the winter, and the Bouvier estate La Sada in the summer. There were ponies, dogs, nannies, and lawn parties, but also raised voices behind closed doors, a father who drank and gambled, and a mother whose temper could turn a sunny breakfast into a scene. Biographers describe a childhood that looked idyllic in photographs and felt volatile in real time. Within that world, the roles were quietly assigned. Some family friends later claimed Janet would refer to Jackie as the smart one, and Lee as the pretty one, a division that sounds flattering but can be a curse for the child who feels she's been given the lesser share. Their father, Black Jack Bouvier, adored both girls, but according to at least one biographer, he especially admired Jackie's riding ability, which left Lee feeling she could never quite match his expectations. The sisters were inseparable. They had nicknames, Jacques and Peaks, and shared nurseries, storybooks, dogs, and the lawns of La Sada. But their mother's favoritism and volatility planted early seeds of rivalry. Accounts from those years describe Janet's sudden rages, the slaps, and then the guilty peace offerings in the kitchen hours later. The girls would be coaxed back with homemade puddings and whipped cream from a can, an uneasy ritual of hurt and repair that both sisters carried into adulthood. One of the most revealing childhood stories comes from Lee herself. In a later interview, she recalled deciding as a little girl to run away from home, and choosing to do it in the most dramatic way she could imagine, by walking over the Brooklyn Bridge. She didn't get very far. She was found and brought back. But the image is telling. A small girl determined to cross a vast exposed space, simply to prove she didn't belong where she'd been put. Schools, salons, and the shadow of Jack's. Lee followed in Jackie's footsteps at a series of elite schools. She attended the Chapin School in New York, and then Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, the same finishing school that polished generations of East Coast debutantes, including her sister, where Jackie's teachers remembered a serious, bookish child who was full of the devil. Lee was often described as more social and more overtly charming, the girl who made friends easily and understood instinctively how to work a room. One teacher later said that if Jackie was the one who would disappear into a book, Lee was the one who could talk to anyone at a dinner table and leave them convinced they'd been the most fascinating conversation partner of the night. Some biographers suggest this difference would later become both her gift and her burden. After Miss Porter's, Lee studied at Sarah Lawrence College, known for its emphasis on the arts and independent study. It was an environment that suited her, bohemian, creative, less rigid than the schools of her childhood. Yet, as with so many things in her life, her college years were cut short by marriage, the proper next step for a young woman of her background. The Bouvier sisters' bond through all of this was complex. They wrote and sketched together, shared crushes, gossiped about their parents, and learned to navigate society side by side. Years later, they would publish a little book called One Special Summer, chronicling a trip they took together through Europe in 1951, drawings, letters, and anecdotes that capture them as they were before the White House, before titles and tragedies, when they were simply Jax and Lee in matching skirts, trying to get a waiter's attention in Rome. Mrs. Canfield, A First Marriage in London. In April 1953, the same year Jackie married John F. Kennedy in Newport, Lee married a Michael Temple Canfield, a handsome publishing executive and adopted son of the president of Harper & Brothers. The wedding anchored her life in London, where she and Michael moved into an elegant literary world of editors, writers, and minor royals. Their circle included people like the Duchess of Windsor and the Duke's ex-mistress, Kiki Preston's set. Some later gossiped that Michael himself might have been an illegitimate royal, though that claim remains in the realm of rumor rather than fact. What is certain is that Lee's first married years were spent in the company of those who understood both publishing and pageantry, an ideal combination for a Bouvier daughter. But the marriage didn't last. Behind the photographs of London parties and weekends in the country, there were fractures. By 1958, Lee and Michael had divorced. The union was later annulled by the Catholic Church. Some biographers suggest that the real passion of those years was not between Lee and Michael, but between Lee and someone else she met in that same glittering world, a Polish prince, becoming Her Serene Highness. In March 1959, Lee married Prince Stanisław Stas Radziwill, an exiled Polish aristocrat whose family name dated back centuries. With that marriage, she acquired a grand new title, Her Serene Highness Princess Caroline Lee Radziwill, and in the eyes of the American press became a real-life princess. The reality was more complicated. Poland had abolished the legal recognition of noble titles decades earlier, so the Radziwills were princes more by tradition than by law. Still, the combination of princess, Bouvier glamour, and soon sister of the First Lady was irresistible to magazines. Lee's life now unfolded between a London townhouse, a country house called Turville Grange, both famously decorated by the visionary Lorenzo Mongiardino, and frequent visits to America. She and Stas had 2 children, Anthony, born in 1959, and Anna Christina, born in 1960. In later interviews, Lee would say that the years living just behind Buckingham Palace, with her children and Stas, were among the happiest of her life. "I can't deny those few years were glamorous," she told one reporter. Through it all, Jackie was never far away, if not in person, then as a constant reference point. When Jackie named her first child Caroline, many saw it as a quiet tribute to Lee. The sisters visited one another often, collaborated on their little travel book, and spent Christmases together in the White House, once Jack became president. But the balance of power between them had shifted forever. A Camelot, kid sister, and the ludicrous talk. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, Jackie's life, and by extension Lee's, entered a different orbit. Suddenly, ordinary sisterly comparisons, who's prettier, who's in more magazines, were rendered almost meaningless. How do you compete with the First Lady of the United States? As one cousin later wrote, Jackie's new status threatened to eclipse Lee's identity altogether. In a later interview, Lee described being in the private quarters of the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when her brother-in-law took a tense phone call and then told them, "In 3 minutes, we'll know if we're in all-out war or not." For a moment, the rivalry stories fall away, and what remains is a family sitting together, waiting to see if the world will end. Yet being the sister of the First Lady came with real constraints. In one candid remark, Lee said, "There were so many things I couldn't do when my brother-in-law was president. After his death, she remembered thinking, 'Finally, I'm free.' It's a startling admission, not joy at tragedy, but an honest acknowledgement that public greatness for one family member can mean invisible handcuffs for another." As the years went on, gossip columns and later biographers eagerly framed the sisters as bitter rivals. Lee rejected that narrative outright. "It's just the most ludicrous talk in the world that we're rivals," she told People in 1976. "We're exceptionally close and always have been. We're together very often, in fact, endlessly." And she added, with a flash of irritation, "I'm nobody's kid sister. I think it's time to make up a new story or go to bed." Dallas, Grief, and the Note on the Pillow. On November 22, 1963, Lee was in London when Stas ran upstairs, his face ashen, to tell her that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. In a later interview, she remembered, "I started crying, uncontrollably, for hours. Finally, he said, 'Lee, you have to get a hold of yourself.' And I stopped suddenly." She later said it was the last time she ever cried outwardly. After that, she only cried inner tears. She flew to Washington to be with Jackie. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who had jumped onto the back of the limousine in Dallas, later said Lee did everything she could to support her sister. She walked beside Jackie at the Capitol as the casket lay in state, at the funeral at St. Matthew's Cathedral, and at the burial in Arlington. She kept her composure until Air Force One flew overhead and dipped its wing in salute. Then, witnesses say, she wept. In the days after the funeral, when the cameras had finally turned away, Lee reportedly left a note on Jackie's pillow. "Good night, my darling Jax, the bravest and noblest of all L." Whatever jealousies may have existed before, in that moment she was simply a younger sister, trying to hold up the woman the world expected to be unbreakable. She stayed for weeks, helping with the transition out of the White House, and later traveling with Jackie and the children at Christmas. When Jackie eventually moved to New York, Lee helped her settle into an apartment only a few blocks from her own. Onassis, betrayal, and a fracture that never quite healed. Then 5 years later, in 1968, another event would test the sisters' relationship in a different way. By then, Lee and Stas were living a cosmopolitan life in Europe and often traveled aboard the yacht Christina, owned by Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis. Many accounts suggest that Lee and Onassis had grown close, some say intimately close, during those years, though the exact nature of the relationship remains a matter of biographer speculation and conflicting interviews. What is clear is that in October 1968, the world learned that Jackie Kennedy, the former First Lady, was going to marry Aristotle Onassis. Lee did not hear the news from her sister. She later said, "Onassis told me. He begged me to come to the wedding." Publicly, Lee congratulated Jackie and played the supportive sister. Privately, according to several biographers, the marriage was a staggering blow, not only because of any personal feelings she might have had for Onassis, but because it seemed, yet again, that what Lee had lived and tasted first, Jackie would ultimately own in the public eye. Some sources even quote Lee crying to Truman Capote, "How could she do this to me?" Though, as with many Capote-connected anecdotes, the exact wording belongs at least partly in the realm of some say. What we do know is that their relationship was never quite the same afterward. They remained in one another's lives, shared holidays, and rediscovered stretches of closeness, especially in the years before Jackie's death. But when Jackie's will was published in 1994, it was widely noted that she left Lee nothing. Jackie wrote that she had great affection for her sister, but had already provided for her during my lifetime. Even in generosity, there was a formal distance. acting Capote and the Rolling Stones. In the late 1960s, Lee tried something very few women of her class dared. She pursued an acting career. Encouraged by her friend Truman Capote, she starred in a 1968 television adaptation of Laura and later appeared on stage in The Philadelphia Story. The verdict from critics was brutal. Reviews were unkind, some openly mocking the idea of a princess and presidential sister turning up on stage. The experiment was short-lived, but it revealed something important about Lee. She was not content simply to drift from dinner party to dinner party. She was willing to take risks, even at the cost of public failure. Her friendship with Capote placed her squarely among his so-called swans, a group of impeccably dressed, sharp-tongued New York society women he admired and mined for stories. Lee was often photographed at his side and was part of the glittering crowd at his legendary 1966 black-and-white ball. But swans and storytellers can fall out. When Esquire published Capote's thinly disguised story, La Côte Basque 1965, filled with barely veiled secrets from that very circle, most of the swans turned on him. Lee eventually sided with Gore Vidal in a public feud with Capote. Truman retaliated by calling her treacherous and gossiping about her love life in print. At the same time, Lee was developing relationships in a very different cultural world, rock and roll. She traveled with the Rolling Stones during part of their 1972 North American tour, turning up backstage in immaculate tailoring among guitars and amplifiers. It is one of the most striking images of her, the Bouvier girl who grew up under portraits at Lasada, now flying with a band whose concerts sometimes ended in riots. Grey Gardens and the Family Ghosts. In 1972, Lee hired documentary filmmakers Albert and David Maysles to make a film about the Bouvier family. As part of the project, they began filming at Grey Gardens, the crumbling East Hampton house where Lee's aunt, Edith Big Edie Bouvier-Beale, and cousin Edith Little Edie lived in eccentric, genteel squalor. Lee's original film stalled, and she eventually retained some of the early footage. But the Mayles brothers saw something in the Beales, the poetry of decay, the strange theatrical intimacy between mother and daughter, and returned on their own to shoot more. The result was the now famous documentary Grey Gardens. Lee's role in that story is small but fascinating. It was her attempt to frame the Bouvier history, to curate how her family was seen, that inadvertently led to one of the most unvarnished portraits of that world ever put on film. Decades later, leftover footage from her original 1972 project would resurface in the documentary that summer, offering glimpses of Lee herself moving through Grey Gardens, elegant and tense, trying to impose order on something that refused to be managed. Decorator, best dressed, and the art of the room. After her acting experiment, Lee turned to something she had been quietly good at for years, interiors, influenced heavily by Lorenzo Mongiardino, who had decorated her London and country homes in layers of prints, antiques, and theatrical color. She briefly worked as an interior decorator. Her clients were very rich. She once commented that she had done a house for people who would not be there more than 3 days a year. Her own homes, a Paris apartment on Avenue Montaigne and a New York apartment on the Upper East Side, were frequently photographed and admired. They were worlds of striped silk walls, dog-eared paperbacks, worn rugs, and perfectly placed lamps, spaces that felt both grand and surprisingly intimate. Fashion writers never stopped watching her. In 1996, Lee was inducted into Vanity Fair's International Best Dressed Hall of Fame, formal recognition of something the world had known for decades, that she possessed an almost instinctive sense of how to dress herself and the rooms around her. Marriages, losses, and the cost of survival. Lee's marriage to Stas Radziwill ended in divorce in 1974, Afterward, she returned more permanently to New York, and for a time was frequently seen with lawyer and real estate developer Peter Tufo. In 1988, she married again, this time to film director and choreographer Herbert Ross, known for movies like Footloose and Steel Magnolias. The marriage was tempestuous and ultimately unhappy. They divorced in 2001, shortly before his death, and Lee went back to using the name Radziwill. Tragedy returned in 1999, when her son Anthony died of cancer at the age of 40. By the time Jackie died in 1994, Lee had lived through divorce, scandal, public career failures, and the unraveling of her second marriage, when news leaked that Jackie's will had left nothing directly to her. Commentators treated it as the final chapter in a lifelong rivalry. But the reality is probably more complicated, as it always was between them. Years of competition and hurt, yes, but also years of confidences, support, and an understanding no one else could share. Privacy, reinvention, and the woman she became. In later years, Lee seemed to grow more comfortable, stepping slightly out of the spotlight while still inhabiting the world she had always known. She worked in fashion public relations and continued to write, publishing a memoir-style photo book called Happy Times in 2001 and a later volume simply titled Lee in 2015. In 2013, she wrote an essay for the New York Times T magazine called In Praise of Privacy, reflecting on what it meant to have lived most of her life in public and why, at 80, she valued invisibility more than ever. It was a quiet manifesto from someone who had been photographed since childhood, a woman who had seen how exposure could flatter and destroy. Asked yet again in one of her last major interviews about being overshadowed by Jackie, she brushed it off with the same dry humor she'd used decades earlier. And then that final, slightly exasperated line, "I'm nobody's kid sister." Lee Radziwill died on February 15, 2019, in her Manhattan apartment at the age of 85. Obituaries called her a style icon, a princess, an it girl of her time, Jackie Kennedy's younger sister. All true, and yet not quite enough. Who Lee really was. When you gather all the pieces, the little girl running toward the Brooklyn Bridge, the debutante in Farmington, the princess behind Buckingham Palace, the sister in the White House during the missile crisis, the woman on the Christina yacht when the cameras weren't there, the would-be actress on stage, the friend in Truman Capote's glittering and vicious circle, the decorator in Paris, the mother holding it together at Anthony's bedside, the older woman writing in praise of privacy, Lee Radziwill starts to look less like a supporting character and more like the main character of her own very unusual story. She was someone who loved beauty and was willing to chase it through clothes, interiors, dinners, friendships, and places. Someone who struggled, sometimes painfully, with being compared to another woman the world had decided to idolize. Someone who failed in public and kept going. Someone who understood, perhaps better than almost anyone of her generation, the exact price of being looked at all the time. And in the end, she left us with a few clear statements about how she wanted to be seen, that the talk of rivalry was ludicrous, that she was nobody's kid sister, that privacy mattered, that glamour and grief could occupy the same life without canceling each other out. If Jackie was, as the world likes to say, the face of Camelot, then Lee was the one walking just half a step behind, sometimes in Jackie's shadow, sometimes stubbornly outside of it, always trying to find a light of her own. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to explore more stories like this one, I've linked a few of my favorite playlists below, along with my most recommended books if you want to dive deeper. You can also join my channel memberships for exclusive behind-the-scenes content. And if you'd like to stay connected, my newsletter is linked in the description as well. I would love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments which detail stood out to you the most, or which figure you'd like me to explore in a future video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves history and elegance. Until next time.